Hi, I'm Paul North, Director at Volteface, and you're listening to the Professionally Cannabis podcast. Enjoy.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what do they do?
Welcome back, listener, to another delicious episode of the Professionally Cannabis podcast with me, Oscar Houseman, and my co-host, Jonathan Weiser. Today, we're talking to someone a little bit out of our normal purview, as they're representative of a think tank that does a bunch of campaigning in this space. But you know what? Rather than pull the rug from under Johnny's introduction, Johnny, can you tell our listener what is going to happen in today's interview?
Yes, absolutely. So for today's interview, we were really happy to have a chat with Paul North, who is a director at Volteface. Volteface being a UK-based advocacy group that have been really at the forefront of some of the most significant campaigns that have led to tangible and direct changes in drug policy and regulation. He really is a top-notch guy, and it's someone that I could both speak to and listen to for absolutely hours. Unfortunately, we only had about 40 minutes with him today, but it's all golden. So less of me, less of you. Let's roll into it.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what do they do?
Today, I'm delighted to welcome to the pod Paul North, the Director of External Affairs at Volteface, a leading UK-based advocacy organisation that seeks to reduce the harm of drugs through evidence-based policy and reform. Having spearheaded a number of the most significant advocacy campaigns in the UK, featuring both politicians and patients, we cannot wait to speak to Paul about structuring effective advocacy campaigns, the current state of play in the UK and beyond. He's an all-round great guy and someone who shares my same television guilty pleasures, but that is something we will get into later in the show. So with all that in mind, Paul, welcome to the Professionally Cannabis podcast.
Thanks for having me on. You guys are so professional. That was the most professional intro and sort of pre-podcasting experience I've ever had. It was wonderful.
Well, we're glad you like the professional experience you get here.
It was great. No, thanks.
We provide a consistent, almost GMP podcast experience. As part of that consistency, we'll ask you our one consistent question, which is what led you to the plants?
What led me to the plant? So basically, my background is in criminology and treatment. So I did a degree in criminology, obviously learned a fair bit about drug policy in that, and it kind of inspired me to try and help vulnerable groups, or try and certainly, originally I went into that degree thinking, I'm going to be a police officer, I'm going to be a copper, I'm going to go and help and protect people. But after doing the degree, my reflections were, I kind of want to be on the other end of that spectrum and try and divert people from getting in trouble with the law and finding themselves in jail or whatever else. So I went into drug treatment, and I worked in drug treatment services for 9 years. And over the course of those 9 years, worked my way up from doing sort of like frontline harm reduction interventions, so like needle exchanges, assessments, running groups for adults and young people. I worked my way up to being a manager and running services for adults and young people. And then near the last year of that experience, got really, I mean, it was working drug treatment was incredible, but it was just getting harder and harder every year to see the harm that drug policy was causing to vulnerable groups that I cared about in the UK. And I remember one day really vividly where I'd been away on holiday for what was probably like a week, 2 week holiday, and I'd come back and I was catching up with things, and something popped up about a client in my inbox, and I thought, that's weird. What's this mean? That's kind of insinuating that something's happened. And I said to a colleague next to me, what have I got this email about this? And I said the name, and this person went, oh, they're dead. They died last week. Has no one told you? And it was then I was like, wow, I've known this person for years. I've been working with this person for years and years and years. And I wasn't annoyed at the key worker, but it was just the kind of like normalization of death that struck me as like, oh no, this is getting too much. I don't know what more I can do in this sort of like structure to help reduce drug-related harm. I was like, I need to do something else. And I know that sounds like sort of quite righteous, but I just had this burning desire to be like, I need to get out of drug treatment and go and talk more broadly about the problems that I was seeing. And really coincidentally, within the space of a couple of months of having that kind of burning desire, I'd started to speak to university lecturers that I knew, because I'd lectured at a few unis. I continued to lecture at a few unis. I've tried to do a PhD because I thought, I'll be an academic and I'll be a doctor, and then I can go talk about these issues. An ex-colleague, Liz McCulloch, just happened to email me out the blue and was like, "Oh, I've been passed your details. Yeah, I work for this think tank in London called Volteface, and I'm writing this report about cannabis and about drug treatment, and you've been pointed out to me as someone that, you know, speaks quite openly about this." And the reason for that is I was doing all these talks and lectures and stuff about drug reform and about cannabis and stuff. And I was like, "Yeah, cool. I'm up for that. I'll be interviewed." So I was interviewed by Liz, and then that I'd never heard of. I'd been so naive to the think tank and policy world. Then I kind of Googled Volteface. I was like, "What? Who are these guys? Like, what on earth is it? Who's this Paul Birch character?" Like, I was like, "What is this?" And I ended up just coming down to London because I thought, you know, I want to meet these guys. I came down and met them all, and met Liz and stuff, and I met George, and I thought this is quite a quirky bunch. And I just thought, I've always been quite bullshit. I just thought, I'm just going to ask them. I'm just going to come out and say, you know, have you got any jobs, sort of thing. And I met Steve for a coffee and just said to him, you know, I'm really interested in this space. I want to make a difference. I've worked in treatment. I'm coming at this from sort of a bit of a different angle. Is there any work for me? You know, I'm wanting to do a doctorate. I'm wanting to be an academic. And I remember Steve really vividly just going to me like, don't be an academic. They're pretty useless when it comes to reform. Just come work for us. Like, yeah, just come down to London and work for us. And I was like, okay. And then everything changed from that. I just literally left my job, left my house, moved to London, and was thrown into this sort of like ever-changing, complex world of drug reform.
And so that's probably a good time for us to ask. And so, what is the work that Volteface does? What when you were offered a job, what did you come down and start doing?
Yeah, I didn't really know at the time. It just sounded exciting. I thought, I'll just go and try it. It's changed. I think what's interesting about it is it's kind of like Volteface is a bit of a weird vehicle in the sense that a bit weird organisation, because it's evolved over the 5 years, well, just short of 5 years that it's been around, and the initial model was a case of, right, let's a lot of the values that the organisation, you know, was founded with have remained up until now, and this in particular is one of them. It was a case of like, well, let's just get some new voices into the arena. Let's get some new people talking. Let's try and challenge the drug reform sector, because I don't mean this in a disrespectful way in any shape or form, but like, the UK's not done particularly great when it comes to drug reform. We don't have a very good track record. You know, we cannabis went from class C to a class B, which isn't particularly positive. I mean, more recently we have medical access, but I would argue that's due to some of these new arguments that Volteface put forward and some of the work that we've done. But historically, things have been pretty stagnant. So its initial conception was a case of like, well, let's shake that up a bit. Let's bring in some new voices. Let's try and engage the centre right. Because if you're coming at this issue, if your intention is like, right, we need to change our drug laws here in the UK, if that's your initial starting position, and you move on to then analyse, well, what do we need to do about that? What you really need to do about that is get the traditional groups who are against drug reform, recognising that it's a moral issue and thereby particularly controversial. You need to get them on board. So it initially started as a blog, a print newspaper, and it was that sort of initial, let's make a splash, let's make some noise, let's get some new voices around the table. And then over the years it's evolved. It evolved into more of a report writing organisation. We would write policy reports. We would use those policy reports to lobby the media and politicians. We would launch those policy reports, make a splash, move on. It was kind of like, you know, pick an area where there needs to be a bit of noise, write the report, make the splash, engage the politicians. And more recently, particularly after the Charlotte Caldwell campaign, it's turned into a vehicle which I'll describe it. It's still it's still got strong traditional elements of being a think tank and creating content, but we'll identify sort of like key areas where we think the government can move or policy can move, and structure reports and campaigns around that. And more recently, in the past sort of 2 years, it naturally has become a vehicle which is more positive and proactive in engaging the industry. So I think the thing that's often missed in this conversation is the huge change that occurred when we ran the campaign with Charlotte, and you know, you then saw those, you know, medical cannabis reforms. Prior to that,
and like, some of our listeners are international, so perhaps let's give them a bit of background on Charlotte Caldwell,
sure,
and the changes in the UK that sort of it precipitated.
Yeah, sure thing. So basically, you know, cannabis has been a class B drug for a long time here in the UK, and medical access to it was unavailable. Charlotte, I remember that Charlotte just kind of like, just about 2.5 years ago, Charlotte was introduced to Volteface by a sort of contact we had in Northern Ireland, and she was sort of just brought over to London and brought into the office with her son Billy. Billy at the time was 8/9, and Billy's an incredible kid, but unfortunately suffers from very severe epilepsy, and he's quite severely autistic. And Billy had been using cannabis-based medication, which was prescribed to him by his doctor in Northern Ireland, and it would reduce his number of seizures from 100 to 0. Right, and many of those seizures were life-threatening, severe seizures. In fact, at birth, Charlotte was told by the doctors that the best thing we can do here for Billy is to put him to sleep. Like that's the fairest, and that's our recommended course of action. And through pure determination that exists in Charlotte, I'll describe as probably the most inspirational cannabis campaigner I've ever come across. By pure determination, she refused to follow that route, and for 8 years sought alternative medications around the globe. Ended up finding a doctor in Chicago who originally prescribed cannabis-based medicines. Saw a huge difference. Again, saw those seizures drop from 100 to 0. I mean, this is a very quick summarised story of Charlotte, but ended up back over in Northern Ireland being prescribed cannabis by a doctor. The Home Office found out about it. The prescription was withdrawn, was taken away from her, and then she came to the attention of Volteface, and at the point she came to our attention, the doctor had intervened. The doctor had withdrawn the script due to Home Office intervention, and Billy no longer had his medication. What we as a team decided to do at that point was we thought, right, well, this is a tragic case and a clear example in which cannabis-based medicines can be life-saving to a young child. So we flew Charlotte to Canada. We got Billy to be legally prescribed cannabis-based medicines in Canada. He started taking the medication. We sent a journalist with him, Ian Birrell from the Sunday Times. The Mail on Sunday. He kind of followed the story. He was over there with her in Canada. Billy started taking the medicine. His seizures dropped to 0. What we then did is flew Charlotte back from Canada to Heathrow with the medicine prescribed by the doctor, legally prescribed in Canada. But when Charlotte landed at Heathrow, she declared at customs, I have brought with me medicine which was prescribed by a doctor in Canada. It's in my suitcase. And obviously customs looked at that and went, yeah, well, it was legally prescribed in Canada, but that's a Class B drug. It's cannabis oil. We can't let you bring that in. And the Home Office confiscated the drugs that were taken down to the Home Office, and Billy didn't get his medication. Billy's seizures then obviously returned, and through Charlotte's campaigning and persistence in the media, we just kept putting her on sofa after sofa, in paper after paper. Eventually, the government relented in the respect that they saw the benefits of cannabis-based medicines with Billy. They saw the public outcry and the medication being taken away and the support that existed for Billy, and they kind of rushed through legislation which legalised cannabis in the UK. Well, legalised medical access to cannabis. Now, we could talk for hours about what that model looks like, limitations of that model, and what needs to be done. But I guess the point I'm making is that was a significant change in the UK landscape. And then from that date, this industry just kind of emerged. And I vividly remember, like, prior to that campaign, we didn't really, we knew there were North American companies, we knew there were American companies, we knew people had an interest here. There was obviously a CBD market, but it was very passive, and there certainly wasn't a group that we had daily contact with. When Charlotte's campaign, not just Charlotte's campaign, there were obviously lots of other campaigns and amazing work that tons of people have done that have helped achieve those changes. But when the culmination of all those efforts led to the government changing the law, then this industry just turned up. People were coming to our office every day, Canadians, Americans, people across Europe, just being like, hey, I heard you guys have gone legal, like, what's going on? And they would come to Volteface. And it was at that point that I kind of recognised, or a group of us kind of recognised, the way in which drug reform needs to adapt to that changing landscape. So historically, drug reform hasn't really positively engaged the industry. In some respects, a lot of left-wing drug reform has been very combative of the industry. And again, that's not to say that there aren't valid discussions and arguments being put forward by those groups. I'm not saying that in any way, shape or form, but typically speaking, the industry have been kept at arm's length. I feel that the industry should be absolutely brought into the discussion, and the industry should play a key role in helping advance and push forward reform. I think they should play a key role in financially supporting it, and I think they're an important voice at the table. But I also think that's a two-way thing as well. I think that there are groups like Volteface that need to have conversations with the industry about what sensible regulation should look like, and they need to be challenged. It shouldn't be something that the industry just runs off and does on its own. And similarly, it shouldn't be something that drug reform runs off and does on its own. It should be collaborative. And really, the past couple of years at Volteface have been about brokering some of those conversations and trying to create relationships in which the industry can have a meaningful, positive input, but also can be held account and try and find those good actors and challenge the not so good ones. So there's a bit of a rambly answer, but I think that's kind of sort of a high level view of how Volteface has changed over the years and what I would generally describe our work as.
I think it's a great answer, and something that I'd be keen to sort of ask you now, and that is, what do you think are the sort of true hallmarks of a successful and an effective advocacy campaign, which ultimately is intended to influence drug policy? And you mentioned right at the top of the interview and just before as well how you guys are starting to engage with and work more with industry players. What type of interactions do you have with the industry, and sort of what are the sort of, I guess, sort of what type of interactions with the industry do you see as positive and constructive?
I think that, to address the first bit, I think the hallmarks of success, it really depends what your campaign's trying to do. I think there are a number of levers you can pull that help facilitate the liberalisation of our drug policies. One of them is definitely campaigning. One of them is definitely public campaigns which generate political support. Although you generate political support by often demonstrating public support, but I meet a few politicians who go, "I'll support this issue no matter what the constituents say." Like it doesn't really work like that. So those two things kind of interlinked somewhat. But yeah, campaigns can be particularly useful. But I also think there's lots of other things as well that play a really important role that aren't so much about being out there publicly doing things in the media. I think. But to answer your question, particularly around what would be a hallmark of success for a campaign, I guess you would want to see the conversation. I think you would want to see the issue that you're campaigning on discussed positively and regularly, and in particular by your opponents. I think campaigns that are poor don't engage the groups that disagree. So a classic example of a bad campaign on drug reform would be something that throws out a load of messages or ideas that isn't engaged at all by the proponents to that campaign. That to me would suggest it's not been particularly successful, and that all you've really done is just rally your base. And unfortunately, a lot of campaigning just ends up doing this. The people sit down and go, "Let's campaign on this issue," and they kind of, let's say this, let's say that, let's do the other. And it's I'm not saying it's not meaningful, important work, but often the groups that disagree with it just go, I can't really engage with anything of that. It doesn't really make sense to me. It's so far from what I would support. I can't even really engage with it. So what you really want to be doing is, rather than just campaigning or doing any particular piece of advocacy work, you want to be aiming and looking at the groups that you need to move, the ones that you need to engage with the subject. And the success of the campaign, well, ultimately, if it's a campaign that's wanting to change policy, it will be, did it change the policy? But you could zoom out somewhat from that and say, did it move the debate? Did it bring on board a new voice? Did it bring on board someone who's typically resistant to this? Did we engage a new group, a new organisation? And when I first started at Volteface, that was my main role. My main job was like, we need to bring the drug treatment organisations into this debate and into this discussion. So a lot of my work was about like, well, forget what people that support us are saying, because they're already on board. I need to think about what matters to the treatment organisations and what makes them tick. So that I would say would be a hallmark of a campaign. Bring on board, shift the debate, create a new conversation, bring on board new voices. Don't just appease your base. Don't just go back to the people that and if you want a good example of this, look at New Zealand. That was a bad campaign. The New Zealand referendum campaign run by the Reform crowd. That was bad.
Yeah, how did they lose? And
well, it was that campaign was also tied into an election and also a euthanasia campaign as well, if I remember rightly.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely correct. But if you break down, and again, I say this with respect and I say this with kindness, because I've I know Ross from New Zealand Drug Foundation. I've had calls with the team. I've met their staff. I have nothing but respect for them. I think they're doing admirable work, and it's an important issue. But if we, the drug reform is too important for us to not be critical of each other. Drug reform is too important to not be challenged on some of these things. People are dying. Like the consequence of drug reform not occurring is the death of groups of all ages, of all walks of life, and that's tragic. So I'm comfortable challenging organisations that exist, and taking criticism and being challenged myself. And I think if you look at the campaign that was run in New Zealand, it was just left-wing frames aimed at left-wing groups, and it played into the hands of the proponents. It didn't bring the industry on board. It didn't create any kind of framing in which people outside of the groups that already agreed with it could engage with. And it just focused on the opponent rather than their own messages. It was obsessed with what the other side was saying rather than just focusing on their messages. And I think that you can get very easily in a combative campaign, you know, when you're up against resistance, it's very easy to just focus on the other side and not focus on your own game. So I think that campaign kind of fell into some of these traps, which is unfortunate because, you know, New Zealand, it's not optically on a global level, it doesn't look particularly good. You know, New Zealand's a particularly liberal country. You would expect, who've been campaigning for cannabis reform for a long time, you would kind of expect that one to go. So that was but yeah, I also accept the points that you're making, that it was wrapped up in an election. There was also a euthanasia referendum alongside it. So, you know, the wider issues, but you would have expected that one to go. So that's how I'd kind of clarify hallmarks of success. Your second point, I think, was around, you know, how do you engage the industry? What does positive collaboration, you know, what does some of those relationships look like? And I think that's a two-way thing, really, because, you know, if you look at the context of what global, you know, what on a global drug reform, what are people discussing and talking about at the moment? Like, what are the kind of key issues, both over here in Europe and in North America? And a lot of the discussions that are taking place now, we've moved on from should we reform our drug laws? We've moved from that to how should we reform our drug laws? Like, it's no longer a question of should, it's a question of how. And when it's a question of should, the industry doesn't really need to be in that discussion that much because, you know, the conversation is not quite ready for them yet. But when it's a conversation of how, then you absolutely need to get the industry round the table, and you need to get them talking to advocates. You need to get them to hearing and listening to issues around social justice and equity. But on the other hand, if you want to create a reasonable, sensible, workable model, and this is one of my biggest fears of reform at the moment, is that if you want to create a realistic, workable model, you also have to make sure that those social justice and equity arguments don't go so far down that road that they end up with something that's not going to work and it's not practical. Now, that's not to discredit the arguments that are being put forward by those groups. Far from it. I worked in drug treatment. I've done a degree in criminology. Like, you know, I know the need for those arguments all too well. But the end result here should be something which eliminates the illicit market, because anything short of that, the issues that we see in our current model of prohibition will be perpetuated. So the end goal must be this needs to work. And for it to work, it needs to exist within the current frameworks in which the Western world operates, i.e. sensible regulation of markets. Now, I think to have those discussions, you definitely need the advocates at the table. You need those issues. You know, you need all the things that people have talked about for years to be raised. But you must also have the industry there for two reasons. One, they're the groups that can practically implement this. So they need to listen and they need to hear. But they also should be setting out to advocates and groups what that could look like. You know, it needs to be an alliance. If you're creating a regulated model and a regulated market, it needs to be an alliance of organisations that help make that happen. It shouldn't just be government. It shouldn't just be advocacy. It shouldn't just be the industry. It needs to be a synergy of those groups. So in terms of what that looks like to me and what that looks like to Volteface, for me, that's about finding good, positive organisations and you know, I guess hearing from them what they can do to implement sensible levels of regulation. You know, I just think that's such an important conversation, and we're in the UK and in Europe. That's where we're going to get. That's where we're going to get to. And if there aren't groups bringing the industry to the table, bringing the right industry groups to the table to have these discussions and to demonstrate the ways in which they can work, then what I fear will happen is that a UK government or European government will say, yeah, we're going to reform cannabis like America's doing it. We're going to reform our cannabis laws. We're going to go for a regulated market. But if we have such high levels of fear around the industry, and if there is so much kind of like, well, we can't really have the industry, it needs to be solved by government or whatever else, and I think we will end up with models which exist like nothing else, like nothing like alcohol, nothing like tobacco, and end up not really working, not really functioning. And that to me is a major problem. The end result must address the issues that we see at the moment. And that means the market must function, it must work.
A point that you touched on much earlier in the conversation, and one that you've just sort of reminded me now, was talking about how you get different groups to accept reform. And you were specifically talking about getting the centre-right to be accepting of cannabis reform. I was just wondering if you could give us any details on what sort of arguments work best on that sort of political bloc that perhaps weren't being used by earlier bleeding heart liberals who wanted reform for the sake of individuals who are in the depth of need.
It's a great question. It's a great question, and it's one that's of particular interest to me, because when I left treatment, I thought this could be really easy. Because all we're going to have to do is we just have to show people the existing mountains of academic evidence that exists around, the benefits of reform and the benefits of changing prohibition. So surely we'll just get them to read it, or you just tell them about it, or and I was frustratingly naive, considering that I'd just spent 9 years trying to convince heroin users to stop doing heroin, which is also incredibly difficult. Like, you could have a long-term heroin user in front of you, someone who's been using heroin for like 15 years, and they're losing a leg because of deep vein thrombosis. Like, it's a really serious physical ailments that they're suffering, and you could say, like, look, your leg is about to come off unless you stop using heroin, and they'll go, yeah, tell me something I don't know, mate. Like, I'm not really bothered. I don't really care. And I was giving them the evidence. Do you know what I mean? I was like, look, here's the evidence. Your leg is falling off. We can see it is rotting. Here's the doctor. They've just said they're going to have to amputate your leg. There's the evidence. And they will go, oh, mate, like, just, I don't know. I know. I don't care. I'm not bothered. And I was being really daft, really, leaving 9 years of working out how to get around those issues, and then jumping into a policy space and assuming that in the policy space, people somehow don't work and function the same way as people in the treatment space. And the truth of it is we function here exactly the same way. Like, just giving someone the evidence doesn't change their opinion. And the reason it doesn't change their opinion, I often talk about like Jonathan Haidt's work. When I first got the job at Volteface, a lot of the team there were like, oh, you should read Jonathan Haidt's work, because I came over as like really lefty, and then I come down to London and started working in policy, and like I'd been in such an echo chamber in the north, such a sort of far left, maybe not even far left, but like left wing echo chamber, that I hadn't spent enough time educating myself around, well, why do people disagree with me? Why do people on the right think that drug reform is a really bad idea? What is that about? So I've spent years exploring this, learning about this, and more recently lecturing about this with students about why do social conservatives disagree with drug reform, and how can you move them from their position of resistance to a position of being favourable on reform. And really, to answer your question, Jonathan, you got to get into like, well, what are these people's values? Like, what are the values? And the issue that has often occurred with drug reform is people on the left, and this occurs both ways. This isn't a left bashing thing, because the right are horrendous on drug reform, typically speaking. But what tends to happen is people on the left will be like, oh, you guys are just cruel and evil, and you just don't get it, and you're just wrong. But really what's happening is those social conservatives on the right, it's not that they like seeing people being harmed from prohibition. It's not that at all. They don't get off on seeing vulnerable groups being harmed. It's just that they are weighing up many more moral pillars and thinking more broadly about society. And fundamentally, the issue comes down to them being concerned around chaos. They're worried about chaos and they want order. So the way in which you get a social conservative on board, or someone that typically disagrees with drug reform, is don't just adopt the same frames that you may adopt as a liberal. Like, as a liberal, or someone who's naturally left-leaning, my natural frames for this discussion would be, let's not hurt people, let's not oppress. Prohibition hurts people and oppresses them, let's remove prohibition. But if I were going to a discussion with a social conservative with those frames, I'd lose them straight away. Instead, I'd need to recognise that, yeah, they don't want to see people hurt and harmed, but they will sacrifice some of that if it helps other areas that they care about, like the wider community, like jobs, industry, growth. Like they're thinking about a bigger picture. So they will allow some people to be harmed if it means that, generally speaking, overall, there is more structure and order in society. So what you have to do, and it's not a case of tricking them, it's just opening their eyes to the bigger picture. What you have to do is demonstrate and show them that drug reform, particularly cannabis reform, creates jobs. It creates industry. It creates innovation. It creates science. It has medical benefits. It is a much, much bigger picture than let people do whatever they want. Let's stop harming people. And it's through the recognition of those broader frames that a social conservative will say, okay, do you know what? I will accept that a legal regulated market may let adults do something that I see as immoral, i.e. them change their current mental state and escape the moment, right? I will sacrifice some of that if it means that the UK advances in terms of its technology and science, and there are thousands of jobs. I will let slip that bit if I gain some of that. And really that's what it's about when it comes to engaging social conservatives. You have to get them to look at the bigger picture and some of those wider benefits. Having said that, you will come up against a fundamental ideological clash, and it almost becomes a thought exercise in that a social conservative typically will because as it stands, what the Centre for Social Justice say to us at the moment is that if you legalise cannabis, more people will use cannabis, and therefore you will have more people addicted and you will have more problems. Now, to be honest, that's true, and we would be daft to say otherwise. If you legalise cannabis in the UK, of course you will get more people using cannabis. It would be a lie to suggest that it would go down or it would stay the same. You will no doubt get more people using cannabis. And statistically speaking, around 10% of cannabis users develop a problematic relationship. So thereby, if you increase the number of people using, you would probably increase the number of people addicted. But in that model of legal regulated market, the harm that group would experience is reduced. So you're increasing the number of users, but you're reducing the level of harm which problematic users from that cohort experience. So on the top line, you could go, yeah, cool, we've now got more people addicted. Well, oh dear, we've got more people addicted. But because it's legal, they won't get criminalisation. Because it's legal, there'll be less stigmatisation. Because it's legal, treatment services can be better funded, so there's more support. All these things will play into their favour and mean that the negative experiences that they feel are less. But it's happening to more people. So it almost becomes a thought exercise of what do you prefer? High levels of harm amongst a smaller group or low levels of harm amongst a broader group. And unfortunately, that's more of a thought exercise than it is anything else. And I think you will still, it will be difficult to get them to move on that bit. And it might just have to be that the support of social conservatives is so low that I think in the UK, 35% of people oppose reform. A big chunk of those will be those social conservatives we're talking about. It might be that they're just such a low number that governments will persist. But if we want to engage them, use those frames I talked about previously.
One of the persuasive angles you mentioned just before was sort of along the lines of the economic argument and sort of looking at practically the here and now. Do you think looking at the UK following Brexit, following coronavirus and the magical furlough money tree that emerged over the last year or so, do you think it will be the economic argument that in time is the thing that really pushes the dial in the UK and pushes on that sort of next wave of openness to the industry?
I think the economic argument is really, really, really important. And I think the economic argument broadens out from just the economics of we're making more money and touches on the science and the innovation aspect. One thing that I find particularly exciting and interesting about cannabis as a drug is its complexity and the opportunities it presents when you regulate it and relax your laws around the substance, not only in terms of recreational experiences, but medical benefits as well. So I think the economic argument is important. I think it chimes well with the current Johnson government. I think there is elements of it that are attractive to a centre-ish Labour government, more of a Starmer government than obviously anything that Corbyn was representing. I think they're important frames and they can get people listening. Those frames, as you rightly point out, are amplified by the context of Brexit, by the context of COVID, and become more relevant. But we should never forget that the gay, like I've spent a lot of time in the past 4 years thinking deeply, reading, exploring what is it that makes politicians tick? Like, how does our current political structure engage with the media? How does our current political structure engage with society? And first of all, you have to give them frames and policy options which tick a box. So like the economic argument does that, right? Like you can see someone like Rishi Sunak getting behind cannabis legalization because he'll be like, hey, this is great for the country. This is great for the economy. We're going to create jobs. We can develop our science and industry and innovation. We're going to be a global leader. We're going to catch up to America. You can see all those frames coming through. But alongside anything that you talk about in the political space, a lot of the time it comes down to PR opportunities to take forward new initiatives and ideas for personal and political gain. And I think at the moment, there are a lot of politicians that would like to grab, Rishi is a good example, would like to grab something like this for the headlines, for the attention in a possible leadership challenge. Johnson, you could identify as a politician who maybe remember Johnson's a politician that won London Mayor twice. Like, that's pretty unheard of for like a Tory to win the reddest city, well, maybe second to Liverpool, but like, a red city, central London, as a conservative, like that's a pretty big achievement. And at his heart, he is a little bit of a libertarian. So you can imagine him kind of adopting a policy or pushing a frame which appeases young people or sees him as like a bit of a wacky liberal. But broadly speaking, the economic argument is particularly powerful and particularly strong. And that's, again, to go back to my previous point, that's why you want the industry around the table, because and this isn't to discredit, again, this is not a drug reform bashing rant, but like I'll speak from my experience. I'm not an expert on markets and economics, and it's not my area of expertise. But if we're going to start putting forward sensible models which do create economic growth and opportunities, if you haven't got the industry at the table telling you what will work and won't work, then what you suggest is probably going to be rubbish. Canada is an interesting example of this, right? Their first model, their first shot, their first year of legalization, you could argue, didn't hit the nail on the head. You still have a pretty big illicit market. A lot of those businesses shot themselves in the foot with their evaluations, and I'm critical of that. But their first shot at regulation maybe was a little bit too regulated to be a success. So if they'd have maybe had more industry discussions prior to engaging with that model, the first shot might have been a bit better. But to answer the question, so I've gone off topic slightly there, but yeah, the economic argument is particularly strong. And listen, let's be honest, the other arguments have been made. We get them, we know them, we understand them. They're out there. It's nothing new. Like, we know we know prohibition is harming people. Like, those frames have been spoken about so much that people get it. And if you go back to the question you asked previously around what makes a successful campaign, get on board the people that disagree with you. And to get those people on board, you're going to have to start talking about it in a different terminology and framing. Otherwise, they're just going to switch off. And the economic framing is one that I think certainly does that.
Volteface isn't just a cannabis advocacy group. You're a form all round, right? So is there something other than cannabis that you've identified as a place where current drug laws can be reformed? Because you seem quite opportunistic in your attacks on broken drug laws. Is there anyone you've eyed up?
I think in Volteface originally, we had a very broad remit of, let's look generally at drug reform across the UK. Let's find areas in which it can advance and change and move. And I think cannabis, because of what's been going on globally, it's a great opportunity. And I think the UK will absolutely legalise cannabis in the next sort of 5-10 years. I've no doubt about it. But there are certainly other areas which I think you could reduce a great deal of harm and are exceptionally achievable. So drug consumption rooms, I think we could introduce drug consumption rooms up and down the country very quickly and would reduce a vast amount of harm. I would support that wholeheartedly because of my experience in treatment. I think there is obviously an interesting and growing psychedelics movement that's going on in North America, and I think that that is an area that I think we will see grow. I think beyond that, I'm always really interested in the discussion around what regulated markets looks like for other drugs, MDMA, cocaine, everything else. But my personal, and this is just my perspective, not other people, that Volteface is quite diverse really in terms of the characters that we have and the views that people hold. So this is just my personal opinion. But I think that for us to get to the stage where we can adopt, serious regulation on some of those other drugs, we need to get cannabis right, and we need to demonstrate to politicians, society, and the media that it works. We can move a drug from Class B to legal regulated, and it's fine. The world doesn't fall apart. The world keeps on turning. There aren't any problems. I think once we do that, we can advance some of those conversations in other areas. I think it goes without saying that the decriminalisation of drugs for personal possession would go a really long way in reducing drug-related harm. The biggest problem I saw in 9 years of drug treatment was the criminalisation of people that had substances on them. That the drugs could obviously be very harmful in themselves, but it was really that criminalisation that pushed people down a path of persistent use and led them to that feeling of being stuck. A criminal record will you can get away with having a bad experience with drugs if Obviously, if you overdose, then it's a different matter entirely. But even then, you can overdose and be okay and survive and learn your lesson and go, God, I'm not going to do that again. You could have a horrendous overdose and survive and move on and have a really successful future. But if you are caught in possession of a drug and you get a criminal record, that can be incredibly prohibitive for a whole range of jobs, and it can really ruin someone's career. So I think decriminalisation would be particularly useful. I'm just particularly passionate about cannabis because that's where I see the opportunity right now. That's the one where we can really make a statement as drug reformers and open the door to wider reform.
Absolutely, you and us both. And Paul, I mentioned at the beginning of the interview today that we have both sort of cultivated a similar penchant for trashy reality television. Mine has certainly come via the sort of lockdown boredom, but I would say I've been enjoying this type of TV shows a lot. Paul, what are you watching at the moment?
Oh man, honestly, like that chat we had the other day about reality TV, I'd be up for just podcasting on reality TV.
I'm with you.
That's like, oh man, we should do a spin-off, professionally trashy. And we should just like,
is that an oxymoron or a tautology?
It's just superb. There's just some superb reality TV. We've gone very deep into
business,
Unreal.
and there's a science to sort of making them fight each other, like putting insects in a jar.
Absolutely. I think you can. People take the mick at me for my love of reality TV, and I think Jonathan, we were chatting about it the other week. But like, I think there's just something really fascinating. Like, it's almost like you can learn so much about people and behaviour watching some of that stuff. And also, you just get to see some like absolute quality TV moments. We've nearly finished Married at First Sight Australia.
Oh, brilliant!
And we're deep into Unreal now.
Oh yes,
we've really gone into Unreal.
Excellent. Yeah, we're just finishing off Below Deck Sailing Yacht for any listeners who also have the Heyu edition on their Amazon Prime account.
It's life-changing TV. I've become a bit snobbish with it now. I saw X on the Beach popped up, and I was like, I'm too hyped. No, so that's not me. It just doesn't touch Married at First Sight. Switch it straight on.
Well, Paul, I do love the idea of a spin-off podcast, and I'll message you about that later on. But for the time being, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us on the Professionally Cannabis podcast. You've been a really fantastic guest.
I really appreciate your time. Thanks for having me on.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what do they do?
Well, thanks so much to Paul for joining us, and thank you so much, listener, for staying with us. And whilst we are communicating at the back end of this podcast, not really a way that people normally frame it, but hey, we are communicating. We're talking of sorts, listener, and whilst we're talking, I would love to ask I have a request, and that request is, please could you like, share and subscribe to the podcast if not already. We really appreciate all the support on the pod, and yeah, passing the pod far and wide really helps us meet new listeners like you. And if you did enjoy the pod, and if you do in general like our podcast, it would be great if you're able to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or any podcasting app of your choice. I actually use Podcast Republic on my lovely Android phone.
But isn't iTunes the most powerful one, right? That's the one we're going
for. It feels
Steal
powerful.
Someone's iPhone and do that.
It feels powerful, yeah. We'd love a 5-star review on iTunes. But yeah, that aside, thank you so much for joining us again. And until next time, bye now.
Please take me above, take me with you.